I believe if we have an economy where people are not threatened with not being able to meet their basic needs, where people are not threatened with being involuntarily unemployed or underemployed, people will then transition, or it will be possible to transition towards the kind of society that Keynes was discussing in his 1930 essay about economic possibilities for our grandchildren. And in 1930, he was saying, well, in 2030, it should be enough for people to work 15 hours a week. You shouldn't need to be flogging ourselves 40, 50 hours a week. You shouldn't need, if you're in the US, to have 2, 3, 4 jobs in order to meet the basic necessities of life. So it's about how you organise the transition. And it's not jobs and the environment, it's both.
I was working for an organisation called Get Up, like a progressive campaigning organisation. Stephen came along to a Get Up meeting. We became great friends. And the big thing that we did in January 2020 was organise the Sustainable Prosperity Conference, 3 days with 400 plus people in Adelaide in summertime. Out of that, people wanted to do more activism and get involved on an ongoing basis. So we started the action group.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. At the beginning there, you heard Gabrielle Bond and Stephen Hale of the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group based in Adelaide, Australia. And in a moment, I'm going to be talking to them about the work they've been doing in terms of economic education and outreach. But just before we dive in, I wanted to let you know in the show notes, we have links to information about the upcoming course that Stephen and Gabrielle are running in Melbourne. Now, in the episode, we talk about the course running on the last weekend of August 2021, but according to their website, the course is scheduled for October. So I guess check the website for the most up-to-date information. Apologies for not being able to be more specific at the time of recording. I've also linked to information about the MMT Summer School run by the Edward Lipinski Foundation in Poznan, Poland, which runs from the 8th to the 12th of September 2021. Now, the official closing date for applications for that has passed, but the organisers tell me there is room to squeeze in 1 additional applicant. So that's a golden opportunity for someone. And that summer school is followed by the 2nd edition of the International European MMT Conference in Berlin on September the 13th to the 15th, 2021. And COVID restrictions permitting, Patricia and I will be at both of those events, so we hope to see you there. So I've linked to information about all of the above in the show notes, along with a link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep this show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So a big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley. Unfortunately, Patricia is away for the moment, but I'm delighted to welcome this week to the podcast President of Adelaide's Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, Gabrielle Bond. Hi, Gabrielle.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. And I am equally delighted to welcome someone who I'm going to say has been a very generous teacher to me, even if not formally, author and economist Stephen Hale. How are you, Stephen?
Fine, thanks, Christian. How are you?
Still good.
Good.
So the big story as we record this is that last week MMT broke through in a really satisfying way in the US when Congressman John Yarmouth, who is the chairman of the House Budget Committee, gave a really clear explanation of MMT, and he answered audience questions in a very MMT-informed way on C-SPAN. Now, Gabrielle, your work with the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group is all about getting that MMT understanding of economics out there and emphasizing what that understanding could do in terms of saving lives and the environment by connecting the theory to the real world. So I'm sure you'll agree that it was a real shot in the arm to see it breaking through like that. But I thought before we sort of talk about how wonderful it was, can you tell us something about your background and maybe the first time you grasped something about MMT that made you decide to want to follow your curiosity?
Sure, absolutely. I was taught MMT by Stephen and Phil Lawn. I met the two of them through my work as an activist. I was working for an organisation called Get Up, which is like a progressive campaigning organisation, and we had recently got involved campaigning for progressive change at the last Australian federal election. And so Stephen came along to a Get Up meeting, and we became great friends, and we've done a whole lot of things together since then. And the big thing that we did in January 2020 was organise the Sustainable Prosperity Conference, and the action group really came out of that. So we had this amazing conference, 3 days with 400 plus people in Adelaide in summertime. And then out of that, people wanted to do more activism and get involved on an ongoing basis. So we started the action group, and we're about 2.5 years old now.
That is one of the things that happens when the penny drops for people, I think, is okay, we have to do something with this.
Yeah.
The things we're suffering under at the moment that are being ascribed to a lack of money, that's just completely false. So we need to get the word out and let people know that they can push for better.
Absolutely. So can I just quickly mention two things that we are doing? So in our group at the moment, we've got a kind of grassroots MMT talk collective. So what I mean by that is our volunteers are developing, half an hour talks with the slide presentation, and they ring up different groups in the community and say, would you like a talk on modern monetary theory? I'm sure you've heard about it. I can come and talk to your group. And so we've got that happening, especially with local branches of political parties. And are very interested, and other groups as well. And the other thing that we've done is we have done fundraising and bought lots and lots of copies of Stephanie Kelton's book and sent those books off to people of influence with a nice handwritten cover letter and saying, this book has changed my life. I hope you read it. I hope you take on board. So those are two things that we've done with our group, and hopefully others that are listening might like to copy those ideas. Please do, or come up with other ideas of their own.
Yes, so you bring up the teach-ins and the deficit myth, and obviously John Yarmouth, the congressman we started talking about, has read the deficit myth, and he's probably had a few chats with people who have done your idea of like contacting people and reaching out and telling them about MMT. And Stephen, I wanted to ask you how you felt about Congressman Yarmouth's segment on C-SPAN.
I thought it was terrific. It's great to hear politicians talking like that. We've had a few moves in that direction over here as well recently. There's a very influential think tank which has a massive amount of resources, unlike us, called the Australia Institute, which interviewed Stephanie last year on Zoom, and the Australia Institute, for a long time appearing to be sceptical about MMT or not engaging very actively with it anyway, put out a video in the last few days where they explained that taxation doesn't literally fund government spending, that the macroeconomic role of taxation is to create room within the productive capacity of the economy to allow for non-inflationary government spending. In other words, they didn't call it modern monetary theory, but they've started using a modern monetary theory frame for talking about government spending and fiscal policy generally. And that's something, now that they've done it, I don't really think they can undo.
You probably won't do this, but it sounds to me like you should take the credit for bringing Stephanie to Australia and opening that door. You know, even though this other think tank that's got a lot more resources, it's a story of like people with fewer resources starting where they are, like at the University of Adelaide, and thinking, okay, how can I get the MMT message out there? And obviously both of you moved mountains to get that conference going and make it as it was very juicy, wasn't it? You know, it was just 2 days, 3 days of like bam, bam, bam. And so I just think, you know, you deserve a pat on the back from someone. So I'll be that person.
Well, thank you very much. We were very lucky. Go ahead, Gabby.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it genuinely is one of the best things I've ever done in my life, that conference. In terms of impact and just the way it came together, it was a work of art.
But it's just great. It's a really heartening story for organisers.
One of the things I was trying to do with the conference, and one of the things that Phil, Lorne and I have tried to do for some years, was to bring together ecological economists and modern monetary theorists. Because for me, MMT is a wonderful tool for understanding how the economy works. But if we can't adjust to live within our ecological constraints sustainably over the next few decades, then almost there's no point to it. If we're just going to trash the world, if all we were doing with MMT was coming up with a more efficient way to grow an unsustainable economy, I wouldn't be interested in doing that. On the other hand, as far as the ecological economists are concerned, they've never really understood, with one or two notable exceptions like Phil, the monetary system and how it works. And if you want to manage a just transition towards sustainability, where you are ensuring that everybody lives in economic security and that you maintain and enhance social justice, then MMT is an indispensable tool. I hope we've had a small influence on ecological economics and MMT overlapping a little bit.
I would say you've had a huge influence, and that is the perfect segue into talking about your course. The Sustainable Prosperity Action Group run a weekend course called Rethinking Capitalism. And when I look at the course outline, obviously it makes me want to fly out there for the weekend, which is totally counter to our objective of creating a sustainable future.
Thanks very much for being so nice about the course. Where the course came from was that after our conference, the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group got going, which is funded by very small contributions from a lot of people. And we did lots of events across last year, but everybody wanted to do something really big again to get some more impetus this January, a year after the conference. But of course, this January, most of the world was locked down. Nobody could travel to Australia, even if they wanted to. So what we tried to do is to take people on a journey, which is what we'd done in the big conference the previous year, but a more interactive journey where they weren't just listening to experts talking to them about different aspects of the economics of sustainability and MMT, but instead they were discussing it and reading things together as we went along. So I did a series of half an hour or 40-minute talks on a whole variety of things. We started off by thinking about what capitalism is anyway. Then we talked about ecological constraints, got onto ecological economics, and I drew quite heavily on Kate Raworth's work. Then after that, we got onto MMT and the deficit myth, and we finished off the first day talking about inequality and what's happened to inequality over time and why inequality is more important than in rich countries, and what's happening to GDP in terms of people's well-being and a whole variety of metrics of what a successful society is. And then in the second day, we talked a little bit about how mainstream economists think. And one of the ways that we approached that was to compare neoclassical economics and what it has to say about how people make decisions and what motivates them with what we get from behavioral economics or psychology. But we also talked about power relations and things like that. We talked about full employment and a job guarantee and related that to well-being and inequality and, of course, the role of the federal job guarantee in MMT. And I talked about state capture, or what's sometimes called grey corruption, or what's at the heart of neoliberalism. We talked about trade and development, and that involved talking about global neoliberalism or neocolonialism and what's happened since the 1980s. And then we wrapped everything up, and people seemed to enjoy it. So we did that initially with about 70 people because we were limited because of COVID with the number of people we could have in the room. But then we discovered that actually doing something interactive like that, it's good to do it in a relatively small group. So we ended up running the course 3 times. Now, Adelaide's not a big city, so after you've done it 3 times, virtually all the activists who are likely to be interested and motivated to come and spend a weekend thinking about economics, you've covered. So what we are planning to do, hopefully, at the end of August, is do the course again in Melbourne, in a much bigger city. And we've got some plans to go to Hobart, to Tasmania. And of course, Tasmania is the state which has, through its state parliament, has had a motion calling on the state government to investigate what it would take to implement a federal job guarantee in Tasmania. And we've got sort of vague plans to go to Brisbane. And I think, let's be optimistic, as MMT comes to be more generally accepted as the right way of thinking about the monetary system and macroeconomics and the role of the government budget within the economy, that's where we'll pivot a little bit away from the technical side of MMT and towards rethinking value and values and what kind of society we want to create in the future, and how we can use what we've learned from MMT to help us create the society. And also, and we mustn't forget this, how to engage with people in a way that's not off-putting and aggressive and impatient, but is encouraging and tries to bring people into the tent, even if it takes a while to do that. And we had some aspiring politicians in the room. We had some currently elected politicians register, but for one reason or another they couldn't come. We had some of their staff in the room, which is important.
We have local government people coming, and they can do a lot with the influence that they have.
Absolutely, but it's so much fun. People were so enthusiastic. That's the reason why we want to take it interstate, basically because some people have asked us to, and we just want to do everything that we can to influence the Australian Labor Party and the Australian Greens, of which both Gabby and I are members, to push them a little bit faster in our direction.
Yeah. And so, as Stephanie says, you're not fighting two battles. You're not fighting the how do we pay for it battle alongside the this is a great idea battle. It just gives the people that extra confidence and toolkit, I suppose.
Looking at the course, you start in the real world, as you talked about, Stephen. You start in the real world with real concerns such as living within safe planetary boundaries. Because I think movements need a target. What are we trying to achieve? What's the right policy outcome that we're looking for? In very real terms, how do we measure that? What do we know to push for?
This is obviously something where I have precisely zero expertise. So like Kate Raworth, I simply take the 9 planetary boundaries that were identified by Earth system scientists like Johan Rockstrom and Will Steffen a little bit more than 10 years ago, and which form part of Kate's discussion in the book, and which there are problems with some of the statistics, which means that their approach is not identical, but which some of Kate's colleagues, not that she works at the University of Leeds, but she works with some guys at the University of Leeds, have operationalised there and looked at, I think, 150 countries in terms of. The most important of those boundaries, of course, are the carbon dioxide intensity in the atmosphere and climate change, land use, species loss, nitrogen and phosphorus loading of the soil. And there are others too. I mention those ones in particular because those are the planetary boundaries which we are well outside at the moment, and so which we need to address. And actually, the climate change, carbon intensity one of those, although they are related to each other, but in some respects, it's the simplest one to deal with. But it's not the only one that we need to deal with, as Kate discusses and is also discussed incredibly effectively. I strongly recommend people to read this book if they haven't, in Jason Hickel's recent book, Less is More, which is a wonderful book, a wonderful call to action as far as sustainability is concerned. And Jason too, Jason has got on board with the MMT narrative a little bit since he wrote that book, and is now talking about a federal job guarantee or a national job guarantee as part of a transition to a sustainable, thriving future community.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to get both of your takes on this. I'm just going to throw it out there that I think the degrowth movement has a name that doesn't necessarily advance its objectives. Like it seems to me when people talk about economic growth or economic recession, they can only be referring to GDP. That's how we measure whether an economy has grown or degrown. And so cognitively, just the name, again, not the movement, but the word degrowth sets GDP up as the bad guy and then suggests, therefore, if we shrink it, we're on the right path. But as we know, it's possible to shrink GDP right down and still be participating in a fossil fuel-centered economy that's killing the planet. But it's also possible for GDP to go up and for that growth in GDP to represent a growth in renewable energy and sustainable practices. So I know we all probably support most of the aims of the degrowth movement, but the name itself seems like a bit of a misstep to me. But what do you guys think?
Well, I guess the people in my kind of orbit are already in their personal lives and the way they live, looking to change the way they live to have less footprint. So, lots of people are trying to live locally, act locally, and not emit so much carbon in their lifestyles. So I think degrowth is not perhaps as bad a brand name as it might seem to the wider population. Definitely on the progressive side, it's what people are aiming for, like, the whole permaculture movement and organic and, active transport, all of those sorts of things degrowth is actually very positive, and because growth is more cars, more roads, more pollution, more high-rise buildings, more rubbish, more waste, more toxic chemicals, and all of that sort of thing.
But economic growth doesn't have to equal those things, which is the problem with targeting growth.
Yeah, well, I don't think they do. But I mean, when you talk to, not that I haven't had a person-to-person conversation with Kate Raworth, but reading her book, and when you talk to people like Phil or the famous ecological economist that we interviewed for our conference, Herman Daly, and you press them on this point, even the most degrowth of them will accept agnosticism where GDP is concerned. And their message really is that by all means measure GDP, but in terms of looking at the quality of life of people in high-income countries, and this is one of the things that we think about in our course, then actually GDP doesn't matter much. Other things matter a great deal more. If you were talking to Herman Daly would say something along the lines of, make sure you obey 3 sustainability precepts. And those sustainability precepts are, don't use up renewable resources, like timber, more quickly than they can be renewed. Don't use up non-renewable resources more quickly than you can develop renewable substitutes for them. And most importantly, don't emit waste more quickly at a more rapid rate that it can be safely absorbed by the natural environment. And if you ensure that you obey all of those 3 sustainability precepts and GDP happens to increase over time, that's fine. If you were talking to Phil Long would say GDP growth is growth, but it's not necessarily economic growth. It's economic growth only if the marginal social benefits of the increase in the expenditure on economic activity, which is driving GDP up, exceed the marginal social costs. And if growth is not within daily sustainability precepts, then that can't be the case. So really, you shouldn't, and I try to avoid using the term economic growth without this qualification. A lot of growth in GDP might be uneconomic. Its costs may exceed its benefits. My view, as far as economic policy and MMT and issues like the Green New Deal over the next few years is concerned, is that if you are going to transition to sustainable economies, then you have to address the quality of life and social justice and economic security for people first. So you have to guarantee people that they're not going to be subject to involuntary unemployment first. You have to ensure that there are excellent, freely available, or where they're charged for, affordable public services first. You can't concern yourself about there being too many cars until there's free or basically free, high quality public transport available for people to use. And also, if we are going to transition away from fossil fuels rapidly and towards renewables, that is going to involve, it's going to involve digging a lot of stuff out from the ground, and it's going to involve a lot of expenditure, which is going to add to gross domestic product, so GDP will grow. And you are going to use up part of your remaining carbon budget, but you're also going to use up part of your remaining budget of the other planetary boundaries which have been identified, making the investments which are necessary in order to transition to what is in the long run a sustainable economy. I believe if we have an economy where people are not threatened with not being able to meet their basic needs, where people are not threatened with being involuntarily unemployed or underemployed, then over time, people will then transition, or it will be possible to transition towards the kind of society that Keynes was discussing in his 1930 essay about economic possibilities for our grandchildren. Remember, he was looking 100 years ahead. And in 1930, he was saying, well, in 2030, it should be enough for people to work 15 hours a week. We need to be flogging ourselves 40, 50 hours a week. You shouldn't need, if you're in the US, to have 2, 3, 4 jobs in order to meet the basic necessities of life. So it's about how you organize the transition, and it's about the order in which you do things. And it's not jobs and the environment, it's both. But you have to address inequality, insecurity, public services. You need a job guarantee in place, and you need a long-term plan for sustainability. Do I think that GDP, when you adjust for inflation, is going to continue to grow at 3% or above for the next 100 or 200 years? No, I don't. There is no evidence that we can dematerialize economic activity to the extent that that would be possible. And that's borne out when you just think about the arithmetic. If you imagine, let's look 200 years ahead. If we were to increase GDP at 3% per annum for just over 200 years, we would have an economy which was 1,000 times as large as it is at the moment. Now, I am ready posthumously, because I won't be here anymore, but I'm ready to be proved wrong about that being feasible. But when I look at the impact equation that ecological economists sometimes use to summarize some of these things and make them easy to understand, ecological impact, population times affluence times technology, where population times affluence, if we're looking at a global level, that's gross world product, basically. And technology, that's about the impact that economic activity has on the biosphere. Now, since 1970, gross world product has multiplied by 4. According to Earth System scientists, our impact on the planet has increased by about 70%. About 1970 was when they claim we moved from what the Earth could safely deal with in terms of activity to moving beyond it, to needing more than one Earth to live like this indefinitely. T can fall over time. The technology can improve so that, as it has done over those years, so that our impact on the environment can get less, but it can never be zero. Economic activity will always generate waste and use up resources. So there will always be some limit. I don't know what it is, but there'll always be some limit to the size of the economy that you can have on a finite planet. And I'm agnostic about where that limit will eventually be, or even whether we've reached that limit already. So I'm not saying that GDP can't grow next year, or even over the next 10 years, or even over the next 20 or 30 years. But do I think real GDP can grow forever? No. It's really overly simplistic and almost childish to think that GDP growth is our aim. What is our aim? What is important to us? We have to rethink those things and grow the things that we want to grow and shrink the things that we want to shrink. And if people's quality of life is improving and GDP is growing and we're living sustainably in the future, marvelous. If people's quality of life is improving and we're living sustainably in the future and GDP isn't growing, well, it doesn't matter. GDP, really, it's an accounting figure. In itself, it's not a sensible objective to have.
Yeah, I think that might be the better point to press, that GDP should be a residual.
That's what Kate says, though.
Yeah. Good. What I worry about is that there are ways to shrink GDP that are very, very polluting. I think it gives some of the worst offenders an easy out if we make it about GDP instead of emphasizing that GDP is kind of irrelevant.
Absolutely. I never use the word degrowth. Not really. I do sometimes say we need to grow some things and degrow others.
Yeah, sure. Turning to you, Gabrielle, it's all about trying to sort of connect people's real lives to this thing that our podcast is named after. In terms of like when you have to talk to somebody who you feel might be interested in this, how do you go about bringing it to life for them as an activist?
Well, I think as Stephen said many, many times, the most important thing for people to understand is the difference between a currency issuer and a currency user, which I'm sure all of your listeners will be completely cognizant of. But a lot of people haven't really thought of it like that, because we are very used to the media saying the government is like a household. They actually literally say that quite often. They refer to taxpayers and taxpayers wanting value for money, and is this a good use of taxpayers' money? And all of those questions are, I guess, the spirit of those questions are fair enough, and people do feel really, they feel personally aggrieved if they see that public money is being wasted and spent on things like $500 million for a war memorial here, when we have, domestic violence shelters that can't get funding, and legal aid can't get funding, and the environment itself can't get funding, and, all of those things. People are right to be mad about those things. So, yeah, I guess it does take a lot of exposure, though. Like, for myself, I know that I needed to hear it not once, not twice, not 4 times, but maybe 7 or 8 times, or hear it, read it, see it explained in Luke McGregor's video. It takes a number of exposures to really have the new idea replace the old. I can remember, what is it now? Maybe 14, 15 years ago, I can remember actually feeling proud to think that my taxes had paid for things. I can remember when we had Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and I was just kind of at the beginning of my career as a employed worker rather than a self-employed music teacher, and having the tax taken out of my pay and seeing all of that and thinking, yeah, I'm proud to pay my taxes. That was a real kind of visceral thing. And that's a hard thing for people to let go of.
I totally agree. And so it's all about reframing it in a way that doesn't insult people's good intentions when they pay tax. They are going, we all put in a little bit, and we are collectively provisioning the things that we want as a democratic state. If it doesn't land right, when you say taxes don't fund spending,
it can definitely make people angry, because it's even more clear that priorities in terms of what is and isn't funded is way more ideological than people are willing to admit to themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I've gotten into the habit, if I'm talking to a certain type of person, to say the government is not revenue constrained. Again, it starts to sound a bit wonkish. And you end up having to just unpack that a little bit and say, look, but what I mean to say is taxation is the mechanism by which the government is allowed to spend. It enables government spending. It enables all these things that we are collectively provisioning. And what we really need to do is understand that, like you say, Gabrielle, that as the currency issuer, the government is in the position, or should be in the position, of budgeting things in terms of resources, not in terms of money. Where do we want to allocate these real things?
Yeah. I mean, I've tried to even just a subtle change, like we need to tax billionaires and fund Medicare, put dental into Medicare, which is a campaign that the Greens have been running for a long time here. But you don't need the tax in order to fund the spending. So tax and, not tax to.
Yeah, tax and, yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay, so over here in the UK, at the beginning of the week, the press were reporting that Treasury officials were looking at reforms to how pension contributions are taxed to quote unquote cover heightened pandemic spending. And I'm sure you've got a version of this over in Australia, and it's certainly happening in the States as well. So, you know, in the words of Noam Chomsky, when you hear the word reform, you've got to reach for your wallet and see who's lifting it. But I was going to ask you, Stephen, you just had an article published in the Journal of Economic Reform Australia entitled "Please no more questions about how we will pay off the COVID debt." It's not debt in the conventional sense of the term. And you've also published a policy note with the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity on this topic. But could you tell us how you go about this issue of quote unquote paying for pandemic spending?
The basic ideas are really just the standard MMT ones. What happens when the federal government spends? What happens when the federal government taxes? If the federal government spends more than it taxes, so there's a government deficit, what that means for everybody else. Everybody else has a surplus. Over time, those government deficits contribute towards what people call the government's debt, but then explaining that the government is the currency issue, as we've just been going through. And so really all the government's debt is dollars the government has spent into the system and hasn't yet taxed back out of the system. That argument is much easier to make now, especially in countries like Australia, I think, because one of the things I pointed out in that article is that compared to Japan, the Australian government had, prior to the pandemic, very little debt. There was 5 or 6 times the level of debt relative to the size of the economy that the Japanese government had compared to the Australian government. And I was just making the point that this made absolutely no difference at all to the ability of the Japanese and Australian governments to fund the spending which they needed to undertake to support people and to support the economy during the pandemic. So it's clearly not the case that what politicians say when they argue, as the Conservatives have done in Australia, that it's our responsible fiscal policy, by which they meant having surpluses and practicing austerity and underfunding public services, which has allowed us to go ahead with this spending to support the economy during the pandemic. That's obviously not the case if you just look at countries like Japan, or for that matter, even the UK, where there's much more government debt than there is in Australia. And it's so obvious now that these ideas are having traction. They are getting through. That's why the Australia Institute has started talking in these terms a little bit. And some politicians are catching on as well, I think. So I think that the pandemic and the deficit spending which the pandemic necessitated happening, whether governments wanted to engage in this spending or not, has given MMT such a big push that, although Bill Mitchell is quite right to say we haven't won the argument and we've still got to push, I think there's such momentum now that it's difficult for me to imagine that we won't win the argument in the long run. Now, there are things that probably we won't win. I think what we're going to see happening is that mainstream economists are going to start talking along MMT lines. They're going to be, and sometimes they already do, telling everybody they knew all this stuff all along. They're not going to be crediting Bill Mitchell, Warren Mosler, Stephanie Kelton, Randall Wray, Scott Fulwiler, Fadol Kabut, Pavlina Cherneva, Matt Forstater, and all the people that should get the credit. And it's not going to be fair. Well, it's up to people like me to make sure that doesn't happen, and that these economists who have spent their lives working on this project do get the credit for these ideas. But it's even more important than that we don't allow them to go back to an austerity narrative. And actually, I think we've got a bit further, maybe in Australia than the UK, because you're right, and I've heard Rishi Sunak in the UK moving in the austerity direction, but they haven't gone that far yet. Our government in Australia along those lines, they're not talking anytime soon, anyway, which they were obsessed with up until a year and a half ago about a budget surplus. So we're not there yet. We've made some progress. There is such a huge amount of evidence in our favour now, which is pretty obvious, that I'd be quite happy to go on primetime TV with one exception of someone I won't name, who's just an offensive person, with any mainstream economist at all and debate this, even though I'm just a humble economics teacher. Because I'm confident that I or whoever did that would win the debate. Gabby mentioned Luke, sorry, what's his second name?
McGregor?
A famous comedian who was on a program called Q&A, which is our version of what in the UK is called Question Time, a couple of weeks ago. Luke has, on a popular TV show, has explained the basics of MMT. He was on Q&A with a reasonably prominent professional economist and with the man who has just been reappointed Australia's Deputy Prime Minister. And Luke, who is a professional comedian, albeit with an economics degree, was the only one on the panel to make any sense. And what's more, it was obvious to people listening to Luke that he was the only one on the panel to be making any sense when talking about the government budget, and that's because he was coming from an MMT perspective. And Luke is discussing this with Bill Mitchell. But we are getting to that point now. There are plenty of famous people, at least in Australia, who have a reasonable understanding of modern monetary theory. Some of them are journalists like Alan Kohler. Some of them are people like Luke. And the more these people engage, the more progress that we're going to make. And there is a tipping point for MMT. Maybe they won't want to call it MMT. Maybe they'll call it functional finance or fiscalism or something. But I think we're going to win.
Yeah, I'm convinced the direction of travel is pretty good. You know, we've at least, as you say, Stephen, turned deficit hawks into deficit doves. You know, whereas before they were like, we need to get a surplus, and now they're like, okay, we admit we have to deficit spend, but we're going to have to pay it back at some point. You know, at least it's, you know, the Overton window shifting in that direction. But I wanted to get your guys' take on something which is kind of technical, but also has a communications element to it, which is this month the G7 finance ministers struck an agreement on global tax reform, which included a global minimum corporation tax. So if you don't use the MMT lens, you're going to see the problem as corporations have made lots of money, the public purse is empty. So if we raise corporation tax, we take the money off corporations, use it to fund the government. But then through the MMT lens, you've got a counterpoint, which is actually the government doesn't take or get money from anywhere and then spend it. So we shouldn't make spending dependent on raising money through corporation tax. To which an MMT savvy person might say, yes, I understand that, but surely we can use corporation tax to make corporations less rich and therefore make societies more equal. But then, if you follow me through, there's this quite hard counterpoint to get across, which is that ultimately it's ordinary people, you and me, the customers of the corporation, that pay the corporation tax. So it's an indirect tax on ordinary people, or as Warren Mosley puts it, it's a pass-through. And first of all, do you see it that way, Stephen?
I take that view seriously. Hyman Minsky wasn't a fan of corporation tax for basically the same reason as Warren. It's not something that I want to die in a ditch about, however.
Fair enough.
And if I was to stick up for taxes on corporate income for a moment, firstly, there are circumstances where very rich people basically set themselves up as corporations. So if you didn't have corporation tax, there are billionaires that would pay even less tax than they pay at the moment. If you close that loophole, well, that could perhaps deal with that issue. But secondly, of course, we're not all full monetary sovereign governments like the UK and the US and Australia. And low-income countries that are not full monetary sovereigns can limit downward pressure on their currencies by taxing foreign corporations on profits generated in their economies. Because those foreign corporations have to buy some of the country's currency in order to pay their taxes, which helps to support the currency and so helps to maintain a better terms of trade for that country. But if scrapping corporation tax was matched by global policies to reduce inequality before tax, plus highly progressive global personal taxation, which was watertight, then I'd go along with that issue. As it is, I think a minimum global corporation tax isn't a bad idea. It's just, I don't think it's the reason I think it's not a bad idea is not the same as the reason that the people that are putting it forward think it's not a bad idea, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Gabby, do you have a take on this?
I would have to do a lot of reading and research to have a really well-informed opinion on this. I think I do remember Yanis Varoufakis talking about, big, huge companies like Facebook and Google, where the people who use them are the product, that he would love to see a reinvestment into those very people by us being paid a dividend, I suppose, through a government putting a tax on those companies operating in the jurisdiction, and then a small amount of that coming back to the users.
Not, of course, that literally that tax would be coming back to the users. All taxes, as we know, just delete currency in MMT, but it's about optics and politics. And yeah, I've seen that as well. In fact, we show a video in our course, which is mainly about Yanis explaining how capitalism has evolved over time, where I explain before the video that I don't go along with everything that he says in the video, but one of the ideas he puts over actually is not so much a tax. It is effectively the confiscation of a proportion of the shares in big listed companies and the dividends that those companies then pay, being used to, in a sense, fund payments to ordinary people. Now, I think politically that might be a way of dealing with colonial and climate reparations to low-income countries, because disproportionately the economies within which the shareholders of the really big multinationals live are in the high-income countries that have benefited from colonialism and slavery and everything else down the years. And I think reparations, hard currency reparation, is important. And when we talk about hard currency, if we are in a low-income African economy, we need to get US dollars. We don't issue US dollars. And one way of doing that, if we could imagine a future where we had a young Bernie Sanders type figure in power in several European countries and also in the US, that you could imagine would be to, as I said, just confiscate 10% of the shares in the biggest companies around the world and use dividend payments in hard currency to distribute to what you're really doing, of course, is you're distributing real resources to low-income governments, and to use that as part of a conversation, which at some point over the next 100 years, it's going to take a long time, but there will come a point in time when we have a global conversation about slavery and colonialism, and difficult conversations, which ought to involve a transfer of real resources from the countries that have benefited from that legacy to the countries that they exploited. Now, I don't mind that kind of narrative in that context, and that doesn't threaten my general MMT understanding of the world, which is that tax payments don't fund anything. They just deleted currency from the system. It's about political economy. Not that I think that's going to happen tomorrow, but it's something for the next generation or couple of generations.
I think the thing we have to watch out for is the conversation itself as well, because I think the powers that be would be like, yes, we need to have a conversation. Let's keep talking. Another 10, 20 years, 30 years. Yeah, talking. Yeah. And really, you nailed it when you said, well, there are nations that have benefited from the legacy of colonialism quite clearly at the expense of those nations that they exploited. So reparations are due, and they need to be in real terms, because, like you say, money is money is a facilitator of real outcomes. So if we can make those reparations real things, that's what we're aiming at. And of course, the longer we can just have a debate on this and talk about it, the date of those reparations being paid pushes out even further.
Yeah,
absolutely. We're still exploiting them, of course. It's neo-colonialism now. But this is another thing that Jason Hickel gets over very well. Once you look at all the financial flows between the so-called North and South, and you take into account the things which people ignore, like the exploitation of very low-paid labour in the southern, in the global South, and the fact that the North relies to such an extent on raw materials that are, dug out from in developing countries and exported by cheap labour, by a profitable multinational which has foreign shareholders. So basically, the profits go to those foreign shareholders, and the low-cost labour is exploited in the countries where the materials are coming from. It's still the case now that the financial flows are going from the south to the north and not in the other direction. We're still exploiting them now, and that's one of the criticisms. I mean, I'm not in favour of protectionism and trade barriers, but modern trade deals are not about free trade. They are about maintaining and extending this exploitation that the rich world has depended on for, of course, for hundreds of years, but in a very different form since 1980s, in the form of global neoliberalism, the form globalization has taken, neocolonialism, whatever you want to call it. These things need to be revisited. We need to rewrite every trade deal in the world if we're going to address them properly. And that's one of the things we talk about on our weekend course. That I don't have an immediate answer to that, but I think it's important that everybody, insofar as we can make this the case, understands that when people talk about the aid budget in the UK doesn't give aid to Africa. Africa gives aid to the UK.
Still,
that's right. That's the way around.
Yep.
In which it's happening, and most people don't think like that.
It's almost like, the title of the book, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read it, but, the idea where that title comes from is that there are these people, their trousers are in rags and they're decorating these houses and putting themselves in debt to do it. And they're, if you think about it, they're acting philanthropically. They're the people who are actually giving, helping with the redistribution of real stuff from the bottom to the top. So just to cap off that corporation tax issue, taxes in MMT, the MMT view that, when you tax at the federal level, you're deleting money. It doesn't apply to countries that have a lack of monetary sovereignty.
Well, as I said, if you force these multinationals to pay taxes at a certain rate and if you force them to record their profits in the countries that they're exploiting, rather than use accounting tricks to record them somewhere else, then sure, they will pay their taxes in the local currency, and sure, that just destroys the local currency. But they are selling their output for US dollars, and they're going to have to use some of those US dollars to buy the local currency. And you can either think of that as supporting the value of the local currency on the foreign exchange market, maintaining the value of your currency, which then gives the country a better terms of trade. It makes it cheaper for the country to import those things that it needs to import. So it helps to support the economy like that. Or you can think of it's as though the multinationals were providing hard currency, which the government doesn't. It isn't the issuer of to the government. So it's a different argument. So if we're very US centric or UK centric, then yeah, I go along with that argument. But if we're talking about corporation tax from a global point of view, then I think we have to be careful that we don't put forward arguments which effectively make it even easier for multinationals to steal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we shouldn't forget, the reason for taxing is to redress the power imbalance to the extent that you can. And I think that's a really good argument in favour of it.
Technically, the argument about corporation tax and not having corporation tax in an ideal world, or if we were just looking at a high-income country and looking at it from the point of view of domestic policy, yeah, absolutely.
See, this is what I worry about, is that people are like, they look at Jeff Bezos, they look at Elon Musk, and they think, yes, we're getting to them. We're making them less wealthy. And we're not. When we put on a corporation tax, like what's happening is if corporation tax is a pass-through, we're paying it. Elon Musk is not paying it. Jeff Bezos is not paying it. We're paying it.
We're paying it because we order from Amazon.
Yeah, exactly, because it's a pass-through, or we buy Starbucks coffee or whatever. But because it's a tax on all corporations, including your local grocery, your non-evil coffee shop down the road doing sustainable practices and what have you, their prices are going to go up as well. So it's a pass-through for the whole economy.
Well, it depends on the fine print of the law. I mean, if it's something like we had here a proposal for like a super profit tax, which really does kind of zero in on that very high profit, really big corporations. The devil's in the detail, I guess.
Of course, if we're not paying attention, the detail will just be, it's a corporation tax. Those corporations that can afford to do the tricks that Stephen was talking about, having an office in the Cayman Islands, and that's where all the profits are made, and then all the losses are made in the other countries where they don't want to pay any tax, where they've got stronger tax laws. The barriers to entry to having that kind of a corporation are not available to most people that start a corporation.
We need to be holistic, though. Basically, there shouldn't be a Jeff Bezos. I don't mean there shouldn't be a Jeff Bezos alive. I mean that we shouldn't have these billionaires. We shouldn't have an economic system which the form of economic system that we now have, which with modern technology and global markets has taken monopoly capitalism to such an extreme where these people are able to become billionaires. No billionaire is ever self-made. You only become a billionaire by stealing money from people. That's the only way to become a billionaire, in my opinion, and we shouldn't have that system.
My point is, I think people agree with you. I agree with you, but they think, yeah, so corporation tax is a way to get rid of them. Through corporation tax, we will stop Jeff Bezos being so rich, and it's like, it's not going to come out of his pocket. It's not going to come out of his wealth.
What alternative would you propose? Maybe we let him go to space, but we don't let him come back or something.
Well, yeah, well, that would be a real thing, wouldn't it? You know, that would be a real outcome.
$240 billion tax for coming back to Earth.
Yeah. I think these are real things that should be talked about, because the raising corporation tax, if what I'm saying is correct, you know, that we will end up paying it, then it's not going to get to him. And in fact, it's probably going to take more money off us, ordinary people, and it's going to take zero off him. So it's going to actually deepen inequality.
Well, it won't take zero off him. No tax is 100% passed through.
Okay,
that's not what happens. But you're right to a considerable to a considerable degree. I just genuinely don't think that the corporation tax argument is all that important.
Yeah, I kind of agree, but it comes up, and it comes up in MMT circles. Obviously, as MMT, as we are going, yeah, tax is there to have a redistributive impact, i.e., you know, make people who are wealthy less wealthy. Whereas when we're talking about Bezos and Musk and people like that, confiscation is going to work. Just saying, right, you're too rich. You can't be richer than this, and say what this is. But so far, all kinds of progressive ideas about taxation have not stopped Jeff Bezos's from happening.
Well, it's easy to stop Jeff Bezos's. I could stop Jeff Bezos from happening. You just change the intellectual property laws and have a very aggressive competition policy. You get rid of his monopoly power. That's the way to do it. But as far as the tax issue is concerned, again, it comes a little bit back to framing, that you have to be very careful how you discuss these things. Otherwise, we look like apologists for billionaires.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm saying let's have the conversation about, you know, changing the law and taking the money off them, because tax isn't doing it. That's why I'm bringing it up. And, you know, a lot of activist energy is going into let's tax billionaires out of existence. And it's like, well, so far, so bad. Taxes have not prevented billionaires.
Well, we don't tax them at the moment. I mean, there are always ways around the taxes. From the point of view, if you want to tax billionaires more highly, actually, I do believe in a much more progressive income tax system. I am not opposed to a minimum corporation tax. They're not the main issue. And I don't want to put people offside by having an argument with them about it. Because, fine, you do that, it'll have some effect. I don't think it's going to be as effective as you imagine it will be. Here are some other things which would be a lot more effective. That's how I would go about having the narrative, a different approach to competition policy and intellectual property. I think matters much more.
So you end the course with how to campaign for a rethink, which for me is really the point to understanding how all these systems work. What do we do with the things we've learned? How can we move forward?
How do we move forward? We have to look at, first of all, work out what our theory of change is. You know, if we do this, this will happen, and this will result in this. So what we're trying to do is really talk to people and raise awareness and talk especially to people who are in positions where they might have some sort of influence, whether they're local government, federal government, or, you know, they have maybe a platform, I think. But we are quite happy to talk to anyone and everyone. I think politically in Australia, it's very difficult because we're sort of locked into a bit of a two-party duopoly. with the Greens as a third party, but not in a position to actually take control of the government. And the two parties are still in the mindset of we must pay back this debt and deficit. And, the Conservatives and the Labor Party almost compete with each other to pay out the other one about increasing the debt and deficit. And that's the case because the people in those parties have been educated in conventional economics, and their thinking is still false, and it's up to us as a population to kind of wake them up. And it's a really difficult position to find ourselves in. And yet we try, we just find a crack in the door and keep pushing, as Stephen says. Does that sound too pessimistic?
It does to me, a little bit.
Yeah.
In that I think that in the Labour Party, young Labour has a large contingent that understand this stuff. And I think basically it's the old white or middle-aged white grumpy old men, bit like me, except not with my understanding of MMT, who are in charge at the moment, that are standing in the way. But I'm obviously unfortunately we don't have as much time as it would be nice to have. But young Labour is much more fertile, and even within the Greens as well. As you know, Gabby, having recently been employed by one of their politicians, the guys at the top, they understand this stuff. They just don't always find it politically, in what is still a News Corp-dominated media environment, safe to talk about it. So it's up to people like us, as we keep doing. You're right, push, persist until something happens. We've been saying that for about 10 years now, and things are beginning to happen. It's up to us. It's up to us to keep pushing so that it's safe for them to have these discussions in public. And I don't think we're far away from that. And the educational side is important. If I could just can I give a little plug for something?
Plug away, my friend.
All right. Well, there are many things that I could mention that we've got planned, but to pick on one, this may never happen. So I'm taking a huge risk here, but I'm going to say it anyway. We are, Gabby and I and others like Phil Lorne and a great guy who's the chief investment officer of our biggest superannuation fund in South Australia, called Con Michelarki, Statewide Super. Between us are setting up what hopefully, once it gets its status, will be a charitable institution called Modern Money Lab, which is a sort of MMT think tank. Stephanie, Kelton and Fadel have kindly agreed to be listed as advisors. What Modern Money Lab ends up doing depends on what happens in the next few months. But one of the things we're trying to do, sort of plan A, we do have a plan B, is to persuade a university, which I won't name, to set up a centre for sustainable prosperity, centred in Adelaide, but accessible to people around the world. The centre would have a research director, who I hope would be Phil Lorne if it actually happens. It will run a graduate certificate in economics, open brackets, modern monetary theory, a graduate diploma in economics, modern monetary theory, a research master's. It will do doctorates. It will give people an additional institution where they can pursue an MMT or ecological economics oriented PhD or lower level qualifications, where we'll keep the fees as close to zero as it's possible for them to be. And there'll be scholarships as well, and there'll be published research. And a big thing for us will be, if this happens, will be the development of global national accounts based on Phil's work on the Genuine Progress Indicator, which overlaps a lot with Kate Raworth, which we think is incredibly important. There are a few such places in the world at the moment, and there are none in Australia. Even, in Newcastle, where Bill's done that great work. If you do an undergraduate degree, for example, in Newcastle in economics, it won't be an MMT one because Professor Mitchell is a researcher and has other interests, and Martin Watts has retired, and there are other people there now. We're not in any sense competing with MMT Ed, which is fantastic. This is something totally different. It's not just MMT related either. It may not even happen, but it's if we can make it happen, we want to pioneer a completely different approach to economics education than is currently available in Australia, or for that matter, anywhere in the UK, which adds to that push for a better future. And the more doctorates we can produce, MMT related, the more people we can get out there into policy institutions, political parties, the safer it becomes for us to have these discussions. Unfortunately, like everything else, it depends on the funding.
Yeah.
So at the moment, I'm going around begging because I need to find about $500,000 from somewhere. So if there is a rich billionaire, after what I was saying about billionaires earlier,
a millionaire, we're not fussy.
Think of this as a good tax.
and you want to give me $500,000 and you don't want it back, then this is the kind of thing we need to do. So that's something we're working on. If that doesn't come off, we'll do something else through Modern Money Lab. But it would be great to do that because we are really sure, as you are in the UK, of somewhere people can go to study economics from an MMT perspective right the way up to doctoral level.
Which I think is great. And I do think it's very important to be very clear for the billionaires listening, which is the point of contact to get in touch to help you out with funding, Stephen. What would be the best place for that billionaire to go to? Gabrielle
Bond.
We have a organisation set up. It's called Modern Money Lab Incorporated, and we have an email address, info@modernmoneylab, or one word, .org.au. And you can also, if you're really super keen, you could Google and have a look at our website, but bear in mind that it is only a working sort of draft of the website, which is modernmoneylab.org.au.
In the medium term, in my dreams, 20 or 30 years down the track, every economics department in the world will approach macroeconomics from an MMT frame. And one of our big problems at the moment, is that there are very few economics departments that's true of. And in the UK and in Australia, precisely none. So we need to do something about that. And that's what we're trying to do.
Great. So for anybody interested, the information about the next summer school that you're doing, the weekend introduction to Rethinking Capitalism, is 28th and 29th of August 2021, isn't it?
That's right. The last weekend in August, and we're hoping to run it in Melbourne, in Williamstown, which is just outside of the Melbourne city itself, which is a really nice area next to the coast.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We're keeping the prices really low and affordable. Hopefully we can get a venue at very low cost through some friends who will help out. The actual event link you can access through our website, which is sustainable-prosperity.net.au, and then there's a page on that website called Rethinking Capitalism, and that has all the details there, including the booking link.
And if we could say, and please don't edit this bit out, that one of the inspirations that makes me keep going and keep pushing is Christian and Patricia's podcast. This series is amazing. It's an extraordinary resource for people to draw on. You've done some terrific interviews. If somebody is listening to this podcast and has not listened to all the other podcasts from Christian and Patricia. They really should go back, start at the first one, and work their way through, because those podcasts are an education in themselves.
Well, that's very kind of you, Stephen. And your obviously years of experience of making these complicated things travel into students' minds, it shines through. I certainly, anytime I want clarity on something that's pretty complicated, I very much prefer to talk to you. So I just wanted to before we wrap, just say, so the information is at www.sustainable-prosperity.net.au and /summer-school, which we'll link to. And for those of us that can't go this time, the reading list is a fantastic must-read list. Are there any other things MMTers should be paying attention to, or things to read, or initiatives that you'd like to highlight?
There's always things coming up, of course. Pavlina Tcherneva is having a huge democratizing work, job guarantee, global conference in October, which I'm sure will be fascinating for people to tune into, where there'll be panels from all over the world.
Okay, so that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for your time, Gabrielle Bond and Stephen Hale of the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group. Don't forget the Melbourne weekend, Rethinking Capitalism. The teach-in will be on Saturday the 28th to Sunday the 29th, August 2021. And if you can get to that, you won't want to miss it in terms of learning from and connecting with other people, not just in terms of macroeconomics, but in terms of outreach and activism. So we'll link to those details in the show notes. But thank you once again so much, Gabrielle and Stephen.
Thanks, Christian.
Thanks very much for having us.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.